To this day, society has still not widely made cognitive space for the existence of femininity that is not aimed at men. The term femme is being torn apart online, as many queer identities are in this world of liberalism and social media. In this video essay, I've taken it upon myself to examine the term and identity femme, from the working class bars of the 40s to the contemporary TikTok drama. I'm not proclaiming to account for all aspects of femme history and femme identity, but I am hoping this will be a broad exploration and an open conversation about femme as an important part of queer history and as an individual identity and practice. All the disclaimers for this video are written out in the description. There you can also find a full list of all my sources, as well as a run-through of my own survey, which I made specifically for this video. The survey got 109 answers before I closed it, and I will quote my participants throughout this video. I will use the spellings femme, femme, and femme when discussing femme as a queer identity in this video. I know that the way I use these spellings will be confusing for some and even upsetting for others. Overall, I ask you to watch this whole thing if you are upset by things I lift and say, and then we can have a conversation. Also, I just started my Patreon, and my first video, a review of Kate Weiss' relationship in Arcane, is up. Welcome to Obviously Queer with me, Katja. Let's get into it. Part 1. Community. Chapter 1. Femme as in butchfem. Butchfem relationships, as I experienced them, were complex erotic statements, not phony heterosexual replicas. They were filled with deeply lesbian language of stance, dress, gesture, love, courage, and autonomy. Joe Nessel, A Restricted Country. The term butch and femme are terms for lesbian identities that started being used around the 1930s. They were used in lesbian working-class bars in predominantly the US and Canada. In simple terms, butches were queer women who embraced stereotypical masculine traits, and femmes were queer women who embraced stereotypical feminine traits. In black communities, butch was sometimes labeled stud, and occasionally fish was used instead of femme, but I only came across one fish in all my research of femme. All other black femmes in butchfem/stud femme relationships call themselves just that, femme. In these working class communities of the 30s to 50s, butch and femme weren't two of many lesbian identities one could adapt for fun. These roles were kind of requirements. One of the biggest historical documents of this time is Boots of Leathers, Slippers of Gold by Elizabeth Kennedy and Madeline Davis, which is a collection of interviews with butches, studs, and femmes during this time. To be an active member of the community, a person had to adhere to the rules to some degree. Whether assuming a role identity felt like a natural expression of her being or something imposes, she needed to adapt a role. Or like Lillian Faderman says in Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, being neither butch nor femme was not an option if one wanted to be part of the young or working class lesbian subculture. Other lesbians existed in the US during this time, of course. For example, middle-class lesbians. But many middle-class lesbians moved abroad, married heterosexual, and had secret affairs. And almost always they strived to pass, to not be seen. As a result, the middle-class lesbians of the 40s and 50s US did not really have meeting places. Butchfem was an open and visible community. A community of working-class women who wanted that community, regardless of the discrimination that risked. Femme, as in butchfem, was as mentioned an identity that existed in this two-person dynamic. Femme as an identity was especially bound to the counterpart butch or stud, since femmes passed as straight unless in the company with their butch partner. Joe Nessel is one of the most famous writers of femme identity. She was born 1940 and lived a loud and proud butch femme lives in the 50s and 60s. Nessel often lifts that the femme, despite her passing, played a huge role for the butch femme visibility. Sure, the butches was always clocked as homosexuals, but it was as a couple the butch femme created lesbian visibility in the US. It was as a duo they showcased love, sex, and a lesbian life. In this dynamic, butch femmes found solidarity and resistance to an outside world that did not accept them. The The butchfem community during this time was a well-created support system that relied on mutual respect for the issues one had and met in their daily lives. The femme often provided emotional support for the butch, and the butch took on the role of the protector. And I mean protection quite literally, since butches often physically protected both themselves and femme from street harassment and violence. The roles for butch femme were not only connected to mannerism, clothes, and different roles of protection. It was also very much a sexual dynamic. To quote Boots of Leather's Slippers of Gold again, the butch was expected to be the doer and the giver, and the femme's receptive passion was the butch fulfillment. Several voices from this time actually define butch femme not by gendered aesthetics, but by these erotic rules. Reggie, a butch woman in the 1950s, says that you can't tell butch femme by people's dress. I knew women with long hair, femme clothes, and found out they were butches. Actually, I even knew one who wore men's clothes, haircuts, and ties, who was femme. Madeleine D. Davis, writer of well-quoted Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, says in her interview, Femme Icon, I had one lover that was not butch. She's very butch looking, very butch acting. She's a carpenter, she has hair 1/4 of an inch long, and she's got wonderful muscles. What makes her not butch? Well, sexually, she was not butch. Maple Maney in Mysteries, Mothers and Cops says, I'm a femme, but I would never wear a dress. But on a gut level, if I walk into a room, I know exactly who I think I'm attracted to. So on one level, it's really just about sexual attraction, to mention some quotes. So the femme and butch identities have historically been more fluent than one might think in terms of gender expression. For many, it was instead defined by these sexual roles. A foundation in the butch-femme relationship was the mutual pleasure of a sexual relationship with a clear and predetermined dynamic, where the butch enjoys giving pleasure and the femme enjoys receiving it. Butches were tops and dated femmes, and femmes were bottoms and dated butches. In the 40s and 50s, as mentioned, one had to adhere to these roles. Women who shifted between them, people that weren't strict butch or femme, were called kiki, a highly derogatory term. Because in this community there was no identity that was in between butch or femme or neither of butch or femme. Instead, kikis were seen shifting between the two, not knowing what they wanted, and disrupted the butch-femme order. In my survey, about 2 participants out of 109 defined their own feminist as sexual preference. Participant 81 saying that femme is a bedroom preference. I would like to highlight that in Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, many femmes vocalize a will to reciprocate and touch their partner more, but that many butches were scared that rolling over, or being flipped, as it was called in the community, would make them less butch, therefore less desired and simply laughed upon in the community. Jo Nessel, previously mentioned, remembers this differently and references this fondly in her 1987 book A Restricted Country, saying that when one moved behind this opening gambits, a whole range of sexuality was possible. We joked about being a butchy femme or a femme butch or feeling kiki, going both ways. We joked about a reversal of expectations. Get a butch home and she turns over on her back. This way of talking about the identity kiki, as well as the easy and kind of loving way she jokes about a butch rolling over, is very different from other voices of the 50s, which says that kikis disgusted them and that kikis must have split personalities. When reading up on femme history, there are, as in all smaller academic areas, some voices that are loud and reoccurring. For butch femme history, that is often Jo Nessel, Amber Hollybaugh, and Madeleine Davis. They were all femmes who lived butch femme lives in the 50s in the US. They were also friends and the ones who started to write things down in the 1980s and early 1990s. They did so after a time of butch femme erasure, which we will go through soon. And they specifically, themselves, has said that when writing history down, they will not add negative viewpoints. I think it can be valuable to just lift that during the 40s and the 50s, in some circles way longer, this very strict way of being butch or femme was for some very beneficial and learning, a safe way to learn about sexuality and sex. And even, as Nessel remembers it, open to exploration. To others, it was clearly limiting and occasionally exclusionary. But in the late 60s and early 70s, it became more common for butch-femme couples to make love differently, and to explore outside the pre-decided roles became openly accepted within the butch-femme community. In my own constructed survey, participant 17 says that femme is being in community with butches and having a grasp on butch-femme history and culture. But also lifts that a common misunderstanding is that femmes are always submissive bottoms. No, they're not. Justice for my doms and tops, who are femme. The same goes for participant 54, who says that for her, part of the femme identity is the way I enjoy the way my expression and style contrasts with my butch partner. And then some connection to the history of femme identities in the lesbian community, and especially our role looking out for less gender-conforming queer people. But also lifts that we aren't all bottoms or subs, and even those of us who are usually don't approach it in a pillow princess way. Your role in the bedroom need not align with your public identity and presentation. Today, when people discuss and talk about the butch-femme community, I think we all can agree it's not about pre-decided sexual roles anymore. In modern-day butch-femme communities, there are no kikis. A femme top is just that, a femme that tops. But the femme's relationship to her identity has always been more complex than only being the femme to her butch or stud and what role she takes or is given in bed. Even though not the case for everyone, many femmes, as in butch femme, would also identify themselves as femmes because they consciously and critically use and choose femininity outside of male approval. I think that reinventing femininity is what being femme really is. It means to take things that you appreciate from historical feminine traits and to repackage them. Javel Gomez, Fishes in a Pond. Femme is reclaiming the attributes associated with femininity that have so often been used against us individually and collectively, and using them for our own benefit and pleasure. Lisa Ordis, Dresses for My Round Brown Body. If the butch deconstructs gender, the femme constructs gender. She puts together her own special ingredients for what it is to be a woman, an identity with which she can live and love. Joan Nessel, A Persistent Desire. Being femme could also mean to construct femininity in a queer way and for queer pleasure. Embracing the parts of you that longed for and wanted stereotypical feminine things, even though you romantically and sexually wanted other women. This meant lipstick, dresses, and high heels, as well as household duties and feminine hobbies. This was a way of being a woman that has never gone hand in hand with feminism. Because now we will leave the butch-femme working class communities of the 30s to 60s and talk about a big breaking point in this part of lesbian history, the second wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism in the 1970s was defined by many questions and issues surrounding family life and work life. Truly life-changing, history-changing, great things. This time also contained, or more like ended, with something called the sex wars, a war that polarized the feminists. The sex wars was a civil war in the feminist movements in the late 70s, early 80s. One side fought for destigmatization of pornography, kinks, and sex work. Another had a more, I'm going to say, a conservative way of seeing it, with bans, ideas of censorship, and stricter laws. There was also another disagreement, and that was lesbian sexual practices. The second wave of feminism openly critiqued the butch-femme dynamic, since they saw it as heteronormative role-playing and a continuation of power dynamics in romantic relationships. The feminism of this time created what many femmes refer to as political lesbianism or feminist lesbians. Lyndall McCohen says in Femme Stigma in the feminist 70s and 80s, the making of lesbianism into a political identity denied its validity as a sexuality. This is especially important to the question of butchfem, because butchfem are gender constructs that arise from a sexual definition of lesbianism. Lesbian feminists misunderstand butchfem because each side is working from a different definition of lesbian. Butchfem has been made invisible because lesbian sexuality has been made invisible. What this means is that the second wave of feminism made lesbianism into a political choice instead of based on sexual desire. Within this movement, a feminism that decentered men, came also the idea that femininity in itself is a patriarchal trap. Femmes are therefore patriarchal victims. For femmes in particular, feminism's failure was its pejorative understanding of femme as an equivalent to patriarchally imposed femininity rather than a positive understanding of femme as a critical approach to femininity. In its misrecognition of femme, feminism denied femme its radical and critical nature. Harris and Crooker, Femme, Feminists, Lesbians, and Bad Girls. Femmes experienced during this time that both feminist spaces and these new lesbian spaces came with a pre-decided set of rules on how to dress and behave. No bras, no heels, no lipstick, or other displays of classic femininity. This was seen as the clothes of the enemy, to quote John Essel. Femmes felt they no longer could express themselves in the way they liked, loved, and felt authentic to their identity. They felt, even though lesbianism had taken place in the public room, made invisible. But in the 90s, there was a kind of butchfem renaissance in many areas of mainly US. And during this time, femmes started to write their own stories down. Many of the academic texts that are classics in the butchfem communities today are written by femmes in the late 80s and 90s. Many did this with a goal to identify and visualize the femme, both inside and outside of her relationship with the butch. The 90s and 2000s came with a new discussion on queerness, something that influenced the term. This new butchfem openly included femme tops, femmes dating other femmes, and overall an inclusion in the community with less strict roles. A way of defining butchfem, as we talked about earlier, that has stayed the same until today. Some academics, like Lillian Faderman and Lisa Walker, calls this version neo-butchfem, to separate it from the strict butchfem roles in the 40s and 50s. These roles are not static, nor should they be. I know a handful of butches who has gone femme, and a few femmes who have gone butch. And I say mazel tov. And many femmes who are carpenters and softball players and who like butches on their backs in bed. I also need to say that it's not only butches who attract me, all kinds of women attract me, and for that matter, femme women have a particular attraction for me. Arlen Istar, Femme Dyke. So what is femme as in butch femme? Well, in the start of it all, it was a community in the early 2000th century in North America, based on expression, identity, desire, and sex. It was a preferred relationship dynamic as well as a support system that benefited both parties. The femmes, as in butch femme, are sapphics who uses femme to both define their own feminine gender expression as well as to define their own attraction and community with butch women. To many historical butch femmes, this meant or included the desire to bottom in bed, to receive and be butch-handled. But today, even among people who use femme to describe their butch femme life and longing, this sexual dynamic is not as predominant, if present at all. Instead, the dynamic is one of protection, community, and mutual respect. Out of the 109 answers of my personally made survey, about 30% said that for them, femme is tied specifically and intricately with the butchfem dynamic and history. Femme is being a butch's counterpart, upholding femininity in a way that transcends and rejects male masculinity, making space for butches and their non-toxic masculinity. Participant 27. I think every femme has their own unique interpretation of what being femme is, and they express that in ways they love and communicate. But on a basic level, I believe all femmes have a deep connection with butches and other mask-presenting identities. Participant 65. Some was very set on this being the only way to define it, as participant 45. There are many ways in which someone can be a femme, but I think a baseline should be an understanding of the cultural context in which butch and femme grew, a commitment to protecting and supporting butches and other queer folk, and be used strictly in the context of sapphic relationship. Or like participant 90 that says, femme is a lesbian-specific identity, the counterpart to butch. Femmes can present in countless ways, but to be a femme, you must be a lesbian, have respect for the label's history, and be in community with butches as their counterpart and co-protector, even if you are not exclusively attracted to butches. Others was not as strict as participant 24, who says that, for me, femme means a few things. It's a subcultural identity tied to the butch-femme dynamic. I am femme because I love butches. Not just in an attraction sense, it's about mutual aid. It's about care and protection and understanding, seeing and knowing one another. But also adds that but of course, femme can and does have multiple meanings, such as in queer men's spaces, though my knowledge is admittedly limited on that front. Consistent for those that answered my survey who identified as femme as in butch femme was that a respect for butches was a requirement. To be femme is to honor and respect this vital part of lesbian history. Part 1, Chapter 2. Femme as in constructed femininity. For femme is not an identity, not a history, not a location on the map of desire. The femme body is an anti-identity body, a queer body in feminine drag. Duggan and McHugh, A Feminist Manifesto. A wider and more genderless exploration of the femme identity started to spread in the 90s and forward. This was done by femmes who's been around since the butch femme of the 50s, and by new femmes. Of the years of invisibility, both outside and inside of the gay community, femmes wanted and needed to define their identity outside of butch femme. They wanted to create specific femme communities. You can see this version of femme as a development of butch femme. Many femmes are not clearly one or the other, but a mix. But I prefer to see it as a branch. An organic and honestly well-received branch that shifted focus from sexuality and relationships to individual identity and aesthetics. Where butch femme's main identification was same-sex attraction for women, this new version of femme is not about female-to-female attraction, but about constructing and creating a self-empowering femininity, regardless of your gender, identity, and sexuality. Gaby Sandoval says in the essay Passing Loqueria that I own my femininity. I have reclaimed it. I no longer have to be on the arms of a strong butch woman to be femme, just as I do not have to be sleeping with any woman to be queer. Despite the misreading of others, I claim myself as femme. Femme has always, to some degree, been about justice, valuing, honoring and queering femininity, to uplift and perform feminine aesthetics, hobbies and practices on other grounds than patriarchal appreciation and gender norms. I believe, and I know that I have many femmes on my side when I say that this widening of the term is not erasing the history of butchfem, but more so branching out to include more queers into one of the butchfem's core values, fighting for the right to be feminine. So simply, this version of femme, which I spell F-E-M-M-E, is a chosen queer identity which mainly centers the conscious construction of femininity in its center. The motives for that constructions vary a lot, as this chapter hopefully will tell you. In Ulrika Dahl and the Lagerreis Volcanos book, Femmes of Power, they interview a trans woman who describes that femme as a gender identity was what made her take the step into transitioning. She, Josephine, says that femme, like any other queer identification, comes in all shapes and sizes, and it's not the identity that unites us, but the issues that we face. We all have to deal with the problem of gender, and our common issues include why the world at large sees femininity as something inherently lesser and disempowering. Here, Josephine touches upon something very relevant to many femmes, femphobia. Femphobia is the way the world looks down on, infantilizes, and judges stereotypical feminine looks, attributes, and hobbies. Like that we automatically assume that if you have blonde hair and big boobs, you are less intelligent. If a woman is wearing pink for a job interview, she is less likely to get the job. The way gay men has normalized the tagline "no fats, no femmes" in dating profiles, as well as how correct femininity is always skinny and white. Or as my participants describe it. I would say that there is of course the age-old idea of feminine being lesser that persists in a lot of people's minds. Even my ma, who is generally very supportive, tends to judge people for being concerned with their appearances beyond clean and tidy. So she views things such as hairstyling or wearing makeup to be largely superficial. Participant 12. Or, as someone perceived as a man, and as a man as well, lol. I would say the ridicule and how people immediately attribute certain characteristics to femme men. For example, immediately assuming sexuality or being seen as dramatic or not taken seriously just because you might be perceived as more feminine. Participant 37. Femphobia is everything I mentioned and my participants mentioned, and for some femmes, this the conflict between society's femphobia and one's own femme identity is vital to that self-identification. Namely, that femme can be a way to approach the world in conversation with society's femphobia, to be conscious of it and to use it. This is an approach to the femme identity that some academics refer to as Femme Theory. Femme refers to the deviations from patriarchal norms of femininity, whether by race, ability, sexuality, class, gender, sex, or the value afforded by femininity. Femme represents disruptions to social and categorical claims. Hoskin, feminizing theory. Or, as my participant puts it, I do believe there are many femme identities. Mine is strongly connected to my intersectional feminism and LGBT right activism. I act from a platform of power analysis in a society diminishing everything labeled as feminine of women as less, inferior, for male consumption, etc., as to empower myself as a queer cis woman to stand proud in my body, my identity, and my expressions of femininity. Participant 66. I feel that, all in all, being femme means having to constantly fight back against a world that is dominated by a very narrow-minded, conservative, Western ideology of what femininity and womanhood should mean. For me, being femme is inherently complicated and contradictory. It's a constant queer conversation between a cultural construct, one heavily rooted in patriarchy, and myself, as someone who latched onto many of its aesthetics from well before I realized I was trans. is a tension between an urge to embrace it and an urge to buck it simultaneously. Participant 28. A conscious construct in conversation with femphobia. Femme as a theory is a way to ask and answer. Is the only feministic way to give up femininity? Can femininity mean something other than subordination and victimhood? Dahl, Skamgrepp, my translation. In my survey, participant 18 said, femininity is often viewed as being curated by and expressed for men. Continuing to say that the very idea that femininity must exist for men is a lie that society tells us. It gives men an unearned ownership of the appearance of women, but it was never theirs to begin with. The femme identity is the destruction of that lie. This participant starts this by saying femme is an expression of femininity for lesbians and bi lesbians. And that is absolutely true. By taking out the femme's attraction to men from the picture completely, we can easily imagine a reconstruction of femininity outside of male objectification, in the ways many lesbian femmes do. But the quote above, the femme identity is the destruction of that lie, could and does apply to a much larger group than lesbian-exclusive women. Femininity is viewed as being curated by and expressed for men. And that does often give men primarily ownership over the appearance of women and over femininity as a whole. But by only allowing femininity to be reclaimed by exclusive lesbians, we underestimate and infantilize the ability of other people to take ownership of their own appearance and self-esteem with the help of femininity, such as bisexual women, gay men, trans women, non-binary people, a large group of queer identities that in different ways can and do benefit from exactly this way of reclaiming femininity. Participant 97, who is non-binary, says femme is reclaiming my femininity after having it be denied or pushed on me. It means choosing femininity for myself and no one else. Participant 37, a gay trans man, says that for him, femme is, as an asile female at birth kid who is struggling with my gender identity, I used to absolutely detest anything feminine and hate myself for whenever I show those parts of me. However, as I've grown and become more comfortable with myself, I accepted it as a part of my identity. Participant 47, a straight trans woman, says that femme is a flavor of expression, one part of my totality. Femme is a way of making others know what I'm referencing when I speak about a piece of me. This version of femme, as Hoskin puts it, disruption to social and categorical claims, is to let femininity be reclaimed by large groups of society, even if you haven't been afforded it from the start. Femme is to take femininity back. As mentioned, the motives for this does vary. It can be, as mentioned so far, a kind of theory or an act against femphobia, or, like my last participants here, a way to reclaim and take back femininity even if you aren't someone who has received it easily. Now we are going to talk about femme performance and femme as an independent gender identity. Leah Lilith Albrecht Samarinsia says in her essay on being a bisexual femme, I would define butchness and femness as the positive aspects of masculine and feminine gender roles performed in a queer context. On a parallel track, I have come to feel that femmes share more with drag queens and male-to-female transgender people than we do with straight women. Continues to say that femme women, like male-to-females, construct their girlness and construct it in the way it works for us. In Gender Warriors, Amber Hollibaugh says that, when you are doing high-femme, your femininity is profoundly made up. And when you are doing it, you don't take a deep breath and say, I'm finally me. Instead, you go, I finally actually look like the way I think a girl who isn't a girl looks. When I look at drag queens, that's how I see myself. I like looking like a drag queen. There is that transgendered aspect of high-femness that isn't about the erotic relationship, that isn't in relation to butches. This way of speaking of feminist as transgendered, or comparing oneself to male to female transgendered people, hasn't got uncritiqued. Trans women have lifted the underlying simplification of the trans identity and downplaying of their struggles this comparison brings. Valid. But what Hollybaugh and Albrecht Samarinsia lifts is that an aspect of being femme can be the way femme transcends gender. Instead of comparing this to male to female, many compare it to drag performance. At what point does the liberal application of femininity tip over to the dark side of, dude, that's not a chick, that's a guy. That's the world I want to live in. Deborah Catt. Femmes of Power. As well as Louise Weaver, I wanted that space for myself, to both resist and embrace the feminine, to be a woman impersonating a woman. For many femmes, this way of performing femininity in a way that transcends the assigned sex at birth has been a powerful tool and coping mechanism. To see femme this way can be a learning and empowering way to grab and use femininity, even if you are assigned female at birth. To see it not as something inherent, but as an aesthetic choice based on who you feel you are. Not necessarily a woman, trans woman, or any other gender identity, but simply femme. Lastly, in this wide definition of femme as constructed femininity, we are going back in history again. It's time to lift ballroom culture. Ballroom culture is a Black and Latinx community which can be traced back to the late 1800s. Ballroom culture persists of found families called houses, which compete against each other in balls. In these balls, you walk the runway in categories, one being femme queen, which is to present at the runway as a trans woman or femme-presenting woman. And another category is femme realness, which is the category in which trans women compete in passing. Femme in this context means mainly trans feminine people and transgendered women. It does not reference sexuality, but gender identity and biological sex assigned at birth. Femme in ballroom culture, and femme as a theory and drag gender expression, which we focused on in this chapter, are two very separate cultures and communities. Femme, as in ballroom culture, carry its own history, its own meaning, and above all, its own historic and contemporary individual experiences. But I wanted to include and lift femme as in ballroom culture in this chapter, because it is another example of the term femme being used as a separate or alternative femininity. It holds a lot of similarities. It is a constructed femininity and also a performance of femininity for a queer audience. I think the main misconception I like to clear up, particularly among my own community, is that femme belongs to lesbians only. To say so erases the decades of history, especially of Black, brown, indigenous, and other POC queer folks who came before us as femmes in their own right. As participant 84 says. So, what is femme as in constructed femininity? Well, it can be a chosen identity connected to presentation, aesthetics, gender identity, and political views that are not limited to sapphic spaces or sapphic identities. Femme is to take back femininity. It is to reclaim and construct femininity regardless of your sexual orientation. Femme is to make space for queer femininity in the public space. That can be by gay men, trans women, or sapphics. Femme is a non-heteronormative femininity or a heteronormative femininity performed in a non-heteronormative way. Clear as day? Well, femme, in this definition, really is a universal and open identity, and circling in everything that it can be is not the goal of this chapter. It can be a theory, and conversation on femphobia. It can be gay men embracing femininity without shame. It can be a chosen gender identity. In this definition, or separate, is also femme as a category in Black and Latinx ballroom culture. My interpretation is that it's a more queer and open expression of femininity, and I know quite a few people who call themselves femme but would never identify as women. Participant 61. To me, being femme is a reclamation of my voice, sexuality, and body. It is the creation of a femininity specifically for me, by me. One that makes me feel powerful, safe, protected, and beautiful. It's an embrace of all parts of me and finding strength in all my softer traits and qualities. Participant 42. Part 1, Chapter 3. Femme as in feminine. What the two identities that we've gone through have in common is that they are political and consciously chosen identities. What they have in common, among many things, is that they are not using femme as a simple description for feminine. In my survey, I asked what the difference was between a femme lesbian and a feminine lesbian, to which the majority said that feminine is a descriptor, meanwhile femme is a chosen identity. Easy? Well, for about 22%, femme is simply a word to describe a suffix with a feminine aesthetic. It's purely aesthetic in my opinion. I wear makeup and feminine clothes, so I'm a femme. Participant 15. Participant number 14 acknowledged that many people use femme as in the butchfem dynamic, but adds that there's people like me who just use femme to communicate appearance and not really actions or anything. Participant number 33 presents a quite rare take, namely that referring to a femme for me is strictly style and appearance. Feminine can be inside or outside. Femme is strictly outside. I think many people who answered my survey are people with a strong connection to the femme identity. They wanted to tell me their opinions and thoughts on something that was meaningful to them. But if you go outside, in more gay and less queer circles, if that makes sense, I think it would be more than 22% who simply define it this way. Femme has been around for a long time and it's taken on many, many meanings. Femme today, apart from two very historical and heavy individual and political identities, also just means feminine. Femme is the French word for woman. The femme fatale is a well-grounded film trope. There are multiple beauty products who have taken on the term, like Selected Femme. There's a great movie called Femme from 2023. I made a great video on that one actually. Well, you get where I'm going maybe. Femme as a word is being used way outside of queer communities as a synonym for something feminine. So it's not surprising really that about 22% use femme as a description for a feminine presentation, and that only. What has happened in modern times when it comes to sapphic identities is that masc substituted butch. I don't know when that happened or why, but in social media, which is very influential on everyday life, there is a clear difference between butch and masc. I want to add here that this isn't the case on all social media and all of internet. In Sweden, people don't say masc as much, but instead still say butch. But nevertheless, in many large sapphic communities online, masc simply means you're masculine. A masc lesbian is a masculine lesbian. Butch has therefore kept its meaning as a chosen identity and has therefore also stayed quite historically heavy. But femme hasn't gotten a new word. Femme is simply short for feminine, as well as a chosen and historically heavy identity. For many, femme is a way to describe your aesthetic in queer communities, just like masc. It's not the reference to butch-femme dynamic, and it has no theoretical or transgendered undertones. It's just your appearance. What I've noticed in these circles is that one has to be masc or femme. And since masc is such a strong and clear aesthetic, being a woman and dressing masculine, everyone who isn't masc falls into the category of femme. This kind of femme as the default is something I also got from participant 74 in my survey. I get told I'm femme all the time, but I've never felt any real connection with the concept. I feel like femme is more of a label that is placed on you than something that people identify as. With me and my queer friends, it's something we might say about each other, but not something we'd add to our identity. I got into a discussion on TikTok while writing this script about femme for femme representation in the media. For me, femme for femme media representation would be like Santana and Brittany in Glee, or Leighton and Tatum in Sex Lives of a College Girl. You know, femme for femme. But when I asked other people what they meant, they said couples like Robin and Vicky from Stranger Things, and Marie and Eloise from Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I would not say are femme for femme. They are just women. I guess these women are femme to many people because they are not masc. And well, one has to be one or the other, meaning that femme becomes kind of like a default for all lesbian women who isn't masc. When I see people argue on TikTok about femme for femme representation, and people argue if femme for femme representation is very common or not that common at all, it's so clear that they are working from completely different definitions of femme. What the femme-masc divide is on TikTok now reminds me of what butchfem was in the 1940s. An identification process you have to adhere to, regardless if you want to or not. I think it's important to lift when discussing femme-masc as lesbian identities that many lesbians are just gals. It's okay to be just a girl. Discussion on part 1. Femme, in the year of 2024, is a wildly complex identity, simply because it means different things to different people, which, in one way, isn't complex at all. For many, it simply means they are feminine and not masc. For others, it's a very consciously chosen queer identity. The chosen identity can be divided into 2 categories. I'm not the first to do so. I've divided it in femme as in butchfem, as well as femme as constructed femininity. Others have called it femme pre-1970 and femme post-1970, and others has called it femme as a lesbian identity and femme as a queer identity. For many people who use this identity, it's not a clear divide. It's not this or that, but for a lot of sapphics, these 2 identities overlap. A common thread through femme history, from butchfem to modern-day femme theory, is its working-class roots and inclusion. Femme can often be seen as over-the-top, slutty and stereotypical. It's an identity that both historically and contemporarily has been adapted by working-class women, drag queens, sex workers, burlesque dancers, etc., etc. This feminist can, as a result, often be seen as bad femininity, unsuitable femininity, differently from white, middle-class femininity that holds a respected femininity, a classy femininity. From the start of it all in the 1930s-40s, middle-class lesbian women described femmes as having too much lipstick and too high heels, differently from them who looked appropriate. But femme writers like Hollibaugh, Dahl and Hoskin, who all has wildly different definitions of femme, still all underline that femme in itself is to make space for and invite bad femininity into the public space. Butchfem grew into being by the working class because these femmes lived outside the strict middle-class morality. Just because femininity has been limiting for the middle-class feminists does not mean it's been limiting for all working-class femmes. If you make the bad girls ashamed, whose agenda are you fulfilling? Tara Hardy, Femme Dyke Slut. Femme is an identity that can be used with other identities and in other ways that I presented. I presented 3, but they're not necessarily all ways to adapt and perform femme. Participant number 2 from China says that I identify as a long-haired T, but in Western sapphic sense I call myself femme. So in this case, femme is simply a translation from Chinese culture, one that would use T, and this translation this participant also vocalizes isn't completely right. It's just that. a translation. Participant 13 says that I could be wrong, but it seems like North Americans are the ones that constantly create these sub-labels, and I don't understand why. It is important to acknowledge, if that hasn't been clear, that butchfem springs from North American history, and the most influential books on butchfem life, like Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, Stone Butch Blues, and the works of Joe Nessel, are books written about North America by American authors. But as it became clear in my study, people identify this way across the world. People who identified as femmes in butchfem was not limited to North America. And differently from what participant 13 thinks or lifts, I believe sub-identities, and especially the gatekeeping that follow them, are a much larger issue than North America. People in my survey who identified as femmes in butchfem had all adapted a queerer and more open-minded way of looking at the butchfem identities than the historical ones of the 40s and 50s. But this group was the only group where the femme identity came with requirements. This was most often that femme is an exclusively lesbian label, as well as that femmes must be in community with butches. Femmes need to have respect for the butchfem subculture and recognize their history within it. We have to protect butches. It's our legacy. Participant 90. Even if a femme doesn't date butches, they should still respect them and understand they are part of the same community, make friends with them, and support them. Participant 87. I view it as an exclusively lesbian identity because of the reappropriation of femininity outside of men's desire. Participant 69. I believe a femme needs to be a lesbian. Participant 31. To mention some. These quotes are all from participants who saw femme, meaning an identity closely connected to butch femme. I would like to lift, though, because I know this is a prejudice, that even though the requirements that femmes must be lesbians was very common among the participants who saw themselves as part of butch femme, there were no transphobic comments. Many participants that identified themselves this way was non-binary or trans women, and though many identities was excluded from the femme identity, trans identities were not. The important part was that they were lesbians and had a connection to the butch femme history. Participants who identified femme more as constructed femininity were much more open to the term having multiple individual meanings. There was also another theme lifted only by the butch femme participants, and that was on the question of what are some femme issues. People assuming our attraction, relationship to and with butches, studs, is a symptom of being heteronormative. Participant 24. That femmes who like butches are cosplaying heterosexuals. Participant 106. And being told that you're not a real lesbian if you only like butches, because why don't you just go date a man then? Participant 38. If I'm to interpret this kind of harsh gatekeeping that we just saw of the femme identity, I think it for many butch femmes stems from the same irritation that irritated the butch femmes in the 70s, namely lesbians trash-talking other lesbians. In the 70s and forward, they were called lipstick lesbians, derogatory, and lipstick lesbians were lesbians that looked like straight women and who wanted to pass as straight women, differently from femmes who wanted and saw a proudness in looking queer. Lipstick lesbians of the 70s saw butches as old-fashioned stereotypes and trash-talked butch femme as role-playing heterosexuality. And yeah, I mean, and I see this being lifted also in modern butch femme communities. The issue and irritation that feminine lesbians call themselves femme for femme and then trash talk both butches and butch femme. And yeah, them. Regardless of what kind of gay you are, you shouldn't express that butch lesbians are stereotypical lesbians and the butch femme dynamic is inherently heteronormative. That is disrespectful not only to history, but most importantly, it's disrespectful to a big part of our queer community. Just don't be a pick-me gay. But there needs to be, in my opinion, a separation between you are an asshole if you trash talk butches, which is true, and you need to be a lesbian to call yourself femme, which is untrue. This we will dedicate the whole next chapter to, so let's go and welcome to Part 2. Part 2, Identity. Chapter 1, Identity Politics, Femme, Biophobia, and high-femme. Since the first documented civil war of lesbian history, the second wave of feminism, there has been an ongoing discourse on the separation between femmes and simply feminine lesbians. Who is a femme? Who is allowed to call themselves a femme? Just like with all identity politics that take place today, it contains a lot of pointing fingers. You are not allowed to identify this way. You can't be femme if you do that. You can't be femme if you do this. There is gatekeeping, there is a demand for exact and agreed upon knowledge, and very little room to actually have a conversation. So let's talk about the online discourse, femme or femme.
All you country boys saying you know how to treat a woman right. Well, all you country boys saying you know how to treat a woman right. Well,
Femme is short for feminine. This is a feminine lesbian. Short, sweet, simple, to the point. Femme is also a feminine lesbian, but there's extra historical and cultural context, especially as it relates to the femme-butch-femme stud dynamic.
You can be a femme lesbian, like you can call yourself femme, just take off the last two letters. Because when you add that last M and an E, that's an entirely different identity than just saying you're like, oh, you're femme presenting, short for feminine. Like, those are two different things. But to summarize, I do not think that you should be calling yourself a femme lesbian unless you are actively working to create safe spaces for butches, and if you are a safe space yourself.
According to a large part of the sapphic online community, femme, F-E-M-M-E, is the identity connected to butch-femme history, so a lesbian-exclusive identity which demands butch-femme knowledge and respect. And femme, F-E-M, is short for feminine and can be used by whoever. This was also reoccurring in my survey. I think I see a lot of people accidentally using the wrong spelling, saying femme when they mean to say femme. Participant 77. The fact that the term is being confused with femme lesbians means that there's a lot of confusion when I say I'm femme, especially when I try to explain how it's related to my gender identity. Participant 85. Femme is a gender or expression for lesbians. Other people may be femme. Participant 103. You might have made this connection already, but in this video and this script writing, I've done the opposite. From 1930s to sometimes in the 1960s, femme, as in F-E-M, was used in the butch-femme dynamic, so at the start of its creation. It's sometime between 1960 and 1980 that writers started to use femme instead, as in F-E-M-M-E. I'm not sure why. Joan Nessel, who is a femme icon, has continued to use the spelling F-E-M because she identifies that femme, F-E-M-M-E, is way too large of an identity. And to separate femme as a part of butch-femme from just other femme identities, she continues to use its original spelling. That was how we spelled it, femme. Nessel says in an interview with Yeaster. It's not a French word, it's a working-class descriptive word. Nessel is not alone in this choice. Other academics, such as quoted Sally Munt, also uses femme, F-E-M, long after its mainstream shift. The author of Old-Fashioned, Old School, A Beginner's Guide for Butches and Femmes, a text I've seen being thrown around in, old school butch-femme communities, writes this on her website. I use the spelling femme as a way of honoring history and the working class roots of butch-femme culture that I share, and to indicate my passion for the traditional butch-femme dynamic, in which butch and femme are inextricable from each other. Additionally, I want to indicate that when spelled this way, femme is an explicitly lesbian experience. From the birth of butch-femme to around 1960, beginning of 1970, this was how it was spelled. F-E-M. Femme is a complicated term because it holds so many different meanings, as I hope you learned from this video so far. Policing who can and cannot use femme is honestly impossible, but people do try. Many people talk and educate as if this femme-femme divide is the truth. It's not the truth. It's a new concept. This is the truth, only in a small, created filter bubble. There is no clear separation in real life, and this divide, differently from what is occasionally claimed, has no historical value. The historical value is the opposite. Femme has been a word for ballroom queerness in the black community longer than it has been a word for butchfem dynamic, because the butchfem dynamic used F-E-M. Many femmes today obviously need a word that signifies that their identity is a sapphic woman who is exclusively into butch femme. I wish there was a way to separate feminine lesbians from lesbians who study their femininity and from lesbians who see themselves in dialogue with butches. As participant 101 asks. Well, here I give it to you. Femme as short for feminine. Femme for those who study femininity. And femme for those in dialogue with butches. Why are people online trying to make it so hard by choosing it to be the other way around when F-E-M was the original spelling? This is an honest question. When I've been online and seen this discourse, there are two other things that are commonly thrown around as facts. The first is bisexuals can't be femme. So let's look at that. And we're not going to do that by looking at bisexuality as a part of femme in the wide definition that arose in the 90s. We are going to talk about bisexuals in the original, old, historical definition of femme as in butch femme, because bisexuals has always been a part of butch femme dynamic in history. In the 30s to 60s, when the bar culture arose in the US and Canada, the women in these communities did not refer to themselves as lesbians. They were butch and femme. When the history of butch and femmes were written down, or occasionally when they were talked about, people would use lesbian. But lesbian did not mean exclusively into women in the 40s and 50s as we define it today. The women who met in butch femme bar culture were lesbians in that context because they seeked out, desired, and had relationship with other women. Instead of referring to someone as bisexual, they were going back to the heterosexual world and then going back to the gay world. Some of these women were obviously compulsory heterosexuality. It was the expected and pressured way, but it wasn't the case for everyone. Charlie, a femme of the 40s and 50s bar culture, is open with her attraction to both men and women, saying, well, I had both. I don't know. I guess it's what you're doing at the time you're doing it. Arlette, another femme, has periodically had an urge for a man and thinks this is not exceptional. She appreciates partners who understands this. Elizabeth Kennedy, in The Hidden Voice, comments on the lack of femmes in Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, which she wrote. She says that since some femmes were bisexuals and later married men, they were excluded from interviews and research during this time. She looks back at this with regret, because these femme voices should also have been heard. The issue looking back is not that bisexual femmes weren't real femmes, but that so many bisexual femmes were made invisible when writing down history. I was a queer femme girl who is going to grow up to desire butches, queer sexual deviants, no matter whether their dicks were biological or bought at Good Vibrations, Albrecht Samarinsia, on being a bisexual femme. This vibe, attraction to the opposite regardless of biological gender, is also mirrored in the extremely classic novel Stone Butch Blues, in which the main character says, "It's funny, it doesn't matter whether it's women or men, it's always high-femme that pulls me by the waist and makes me sweat." As Claire Hemming says in Butch Femme, Inside Lesbian Gender, my resistance to marking out bisexual femme subjectivity as only and always separate from lesbian femme subjectivity is firstly, because this would appear to misrepresent the history of the relationship, both historically and contemporarily, and secondly, because they are bound to be points where the two subject positions are mutually informative, overlap, or are indistinguishable from one another. These moments do not necessarily involve the erasure of one subject over another. Simply, lesbian women and bisexual women share butch femme history, and no one is erasing anyone if we let it be that way. When you see someone on TikTok that claims that bisexual women can't be femme as in butchfem, know that has no historical value or foundation. This is only a prejudice based on bisexual invisibility, erasure, and change of meaning in words. The other part of femme discourse and policing identities that I would like to uplift is the discussion on high-femme. As previously mentioned, Amber Hollybaugh lifts the high-femme as a woman in feminine drag, and in just quoted Stone Butch Blues, high-femme regardless of gender identity is the object of desire for main character Jess. For many of the people in my survey, this was also how they defined high-femme. Expressing yourself with hyper-femininity, highly feminine, like extreme, perhaps even to the point of camp. It's like the bimbo, or kawaii, or Afro-paddy fashion, or do drag. This is one way of defining high-femme. Like some people said, it's Strap of Roan. It's Chrissy Kalpeka. There is another definition as well, which is that high-femme refers to a sexual preference. Asapphic lesbian women who only bottoms. The femme version of Stone Butch. Stone Butch is a well-known term founded in the 40s and a really popular identity in lesbian communities in the 50s. Stone Butch is a butch woman that only tops, meaning that sexually she only gives and never receives. High-femme, for some, are the bottom version of this. You only receive sexually. So it's really simple, really. Some use high-femme as a descriptor for the way they embrace femininity in an out-of-the-ordinary way, and others use high-femme to describe one's sexual preference. But online, again. People often have a way to talk about identities in a black and white way, with many pointing fingers and a black and white view on labeled discourse. There were absolutely traces of this in my survey. A high-femme is a term for a femme lesbian who strictly bottoms, or a stone bottom or pillow princess. It is the other half to Stone Butch. It is not an aesthetic descriptor, and I wish people would stop using it that way. Participant 45. A high-femme is a stone-bottom femme, someone who only receives sexually, the direct antithesis to Stone Butch. I don't believe and never will believe that high-femme is someone hyper-feminine. Participant 17. By definition, a femme lesbian who is a 100% bottom. Participant 36. I want to highlight this because this is another example of people online that refer to something as the truth, usually with history as their source. If high-femme for you means 100% to bottom, a stone femme, that's your interpretation and absolutely valid. But it isn't the meaning by definition, and it is also an aesthetic descriptor. In research for this video, I read so much history about femme life and identity from 1930 and forward. Not once did I come across high-femme as meaning pillow princess. I'm not saying that means it never happened. I haven't read all of femme history. But what I'm saying is that it's easy to hear someone argue for something online and take it as the truth, when reality is much more complex. As a counterpart to Stone Butch, Joan Nessel puts the femme wife. Pro-femme is used by Laura Harris and Liz Ortiz. Stone femme is used recurring in much of the literature I've read. Amber Hollybaugh, as mentioned in previous chapters, said, when you're doing high-femme, your femininity is profoundly made up. There is that transgendered aspect of high-feminist that isn't about the erotic relationship, that isn't in relationship to butches. Highlighting here really the opposite, that high-feminist is the one femme identity completely untethered to butches and to sexuality. Sally Armand, in her 1998 book Butchfem, also describes high-femme this way, often describing how campy feminists toys with the tension between high-femme and drag queen. And I'm not saying this to argue that high-femme can't mean 100% the bottom. I'm saying this to argue the exact opposite. It's not crystal clear. Identity politics are a new, complicated and messy discourse. Sub-identities, also called mogai, marginalized orientations, gender alignments, and intersex, is a way to talk about queer identities outside of the umbrella terms LGBTQ. Mogai identities are ultra-specific and have divided the queer community. When talking about Mogai micro-labeling and its pros-cons, I cannot put it into better words than participant 82 in my survey. While I think wanting to seek out labels for oneself is a healthy and honorable decision, I think the collective demand in the queer community for hyper-specific labels has caused internal damage within the community. Many people are faced with the idea of, am I being LGBTQIA queer correctly? Or am I allowed to use this label for myself or risk ostracization from the LGBTQIA queer community? Or similar questions, which leads to significant amount of gatekeeping and lack of acceptance. I also think there's extremely high demand for queer people to immediately have an in-depth knowledge of every area of queer culture and to often chastise other queers for not being aware of, not understanding the depth and nuance of the vocabulary makes for a toxic environment for people still exploring their sexuality. It is also a difficult and potentially toxic environment for people who have not had the same level of access to the queer community due to language barriers, culture differences, or lack of exposure. This amount of infighting has also caused the community to be more susceptible to outside discrimination, scrutiny, and attack on personal, professional, and legal levels. Participant 82. Amen. This issue of am I queer in the right way or am I allowed to use femme as an identity was also lifted in my survey. Participant 95 said that identifying as arrow ace and NB really helped me to become more comfortable in my own skin and realize my experiences were valid. But it didn't really quell most of the complicated feelings I had towards femininity and being femme, mostly out of feeling like I didn't really fit in being so. Participant 98 said that personally, I struggle with feeling valid and questioning whether I can claim this identity for myself, as I am not someone who exclusively dates people who identify as butch and will also date more androgynous lesbians. You know what? 95 and 98, you are allowed to claim femme. If you feel comfortable and feel any kind of relief, joy, community, or empowerment in the femme identity, it is yours to use. Here's one way of looking at micro-labeling and identity gatekeeping that I think many people can benefit from listening to. Define your sub-identity based on how you feel about it and what it means to you. Don't describe your identity based on what it's not allowed to mean for other people. For example, if you identify as pansexual, describe that identity on what it means to you. Do not describe that identity based on its differences from bisexuality, since that often comes at the expense of bisexuals who might not define their identity in the same way that you do. If being high-femme is a sexual identity to you, explain that. If being femme for you is about being in community to butches, say that. But do not go into the comment fields of people saying that they are bisexual femmes and explain to them that that is impossible. Because 1, other identities are their identities and do not automatically threaten yours. And 2, it's not even historically incorrect. And lastly, if you want people to understand the history, value, and basis on which your identity is created, educate people with actual history, not things you've only heard on TikTok. Normalize asking for sources. Practice a critical way of approaching information. Make your own conclusions. There is a large issue online with people educating others without having done the research. This video is done by a creator who starts the video by saying she's taken the information from TikTok and herself has done some light Googling. This way of online education is laughable at best and dangerous at worst. There was a conference in 2006 in San Francisco called simply the Femme 2006 conference, hosted by none other than Amber Hollibaugh. Hollibaugh has been quoted in this video and is often referred to as one of the 3 legendary historical femmes together with Joan Nessel and Madeleine Davis. In the introduction to that conference, Jessica Humphrey, who was the hostess, said, "There are two models for making community. One is the exclusionary model, where you have to fit a certain criteria. The other, the one we are using, is that anyone who identifies as femme, regardless of what that means to them, is welcome." Part 2, Chapter 2, Femme Issues. In my survey, I asked the question, regardless of how you define femme, what are the struggles and issues of being femme today? This had the most coherent answers of all. There was, in this question, a kind of agreement. If there is anything that connects what otherwise is a pretty fragmented identity, it is the different issues of femme invisibility. The question of femme invisibility is a red thread that spans from the stories of femmes in the 1930s Buffalo to the femmes who answered my survey almost 100 years later. Queer femininity, for women assigned female at birth, comes with invisibility. Due to our heteronormative way of seeing and reading queerness, a woman that adapts feminine traits is not read as a queer woman. Not by outsiders, the heterosexuals, nor by her queer peers. This creates a double invisibility. For sapphic people specifically, it can be frustrating that their queerness doesn't come across, making them feel isolated from the community because of their perception of others. Participant 92. Femmes can also pass easier than other queer people, especially if they're cis, but can become alienated from queer spaces and communities by not looking queer enough. Participant 7. The struggle in dating life is that you are straight passing and other lesbians don't recognize you and therefore don't see you as an option if they don't know that you're queer. Participant 41. This issue was described over and over again. Being femme means being straight passing. Everyone, especially women, thinks you're straight, being invisible in the queer community. The first issue that my participant lifted is that the straight world sees you as a straight person, resulting in not only a feeling of invisibility, but also the need to constantly make the choice to come out or not. Straight people assume that you are heterosexual, and it can be hard to come out in school/work and other places because they don't read you as a lesbian. You always have to come out again and again. Participant 41. Having to come out to everyone if you want them to know. Otherwise, almost everyone you meet will say you're straight. Participant 102. Lisa Ortiz describes this in Dresses for My Round Brown Body. Every time I am mistaken as straight, I make the decision whether to come out or not. Being femme often requires an active commitment to being out and proud. The second issue is the invisibility this creates in the queer community. Nobody knows I'm sapphic. Sort of compounding that issue, I often find myself afraid to enter lesbian spaces because I don't always feel like I look like I belong there. And that prevents me from having the community/relationship I want. Participant 79. It's sometimes hard to feel like I don't look queer enough to be recognized by my community. People often assume I'm straight because I appear feminine, and I feel that I'm forced to do more explaining/defending of my lesbian identity than people who are more visibly queer. Participant 9. Because with femme invisibility can also come the demand to prove your queerness. While a masked lesbian is proof of queerness in its own existence, a gender non-conformative way of presenting to the world, the femme identity can come with a demand to prove that identity. This, as lifted by, for example, academic Jocelyn Bartram-Scott, is an issue that completely erases femmes that are sexually fluid or asexual. Bisexual femmes and asexual femmes stand no chance to prove their identity, since it's not, in their case, dependent on a same-sex partner. Another kind of invisibility, one that is based on the demand to prove your identity, is lifted by participant 12. Specifically speaking from a trans mask perspective, I lack the confidence to experiment with more femme styling and energy. I don't think it's something I like to do often, but even then, I think the struggle to pass often gets in the way of me being who I want to be, even if I try not to care about these things. This is also lifted by another trans man in Hoskin and Blair's qualitative study. Additionally, I'm sure people have wondered why I transitioned if I like pink, go to musicals, bake, etc. I have the feeling that some people would make the transphobic assumption that I'm not really a man at all. Hoskin and Blair, Experiences of Femme Identity. This is closely connected to femmephobia and the femme identity that is largely based on constructed femininity, namely, who is allowed to use femininity and construct it in their own identities. Trans men, as lifted above, is one queer identity that can struggle both internally and externally with the femme identity, since they must constantly pass or try to pass to be taken seriously in their male identity. Another group that struggles with invisibility and complexity with the femme identity are people of color. Black femmes and femmes of color experience paradoxical visibility. They are simultaneously present, often hypervisible, yet largely invisible or unauthenticated as femme or feminine. Hoskin and Taylor, Femme Resistance. Black women carry a long history of masculinization, and black women, regardless of sapphic identity, therefore have to go harder and further in their femininity to be seen as feminine. I think it's common for that question to pop into your head. It's that question of, am I femme because that's the expression that best fits me, or do I see myself as femme because as a black woman it would be more difficult for people to see me as a woman if I'm not? Participant 76. Participant 76 then continues to say that I'm not a trans woman, but it's not uncommon for black cis women who are femmes like me to be seen as trans women or travestis. Participant 76 really circles in here the fine line that black women have to walk, since society deems blackness as by default masculine, both too little and too much femininity can make society question their identity and gender. As a white, quite petite, cis woman, my femininity is given to me. My existence aligns with what is seen and appreciated as feminine attributes. It does not take a lot of work for me to be seen as feminine. This is not the case for old women, fat women, and black women. So when we are referring to femmes, who are we really talking about? The mental images we developed from the word are probably a white woman, and that can easily be tied into the masculinization of non-white bodies and non-skinny bodies as well. But essentially, this is tied into the beauty ideals forced upon women and gender expectations, which in some sense creates a basis for the femme identity. Participant 78. Javel Gomez says in Fishes in a Pond from 1997 that as a black femme, she's experienced a difficulty from other people to see her as both black and a lesbian. She describes that as an out lesbian, other black women did not refer to her as black. I wasn't black because I identified as a lesbian. As a dual minority, you can often feel you have to choose which one to present. You can be lesbian or black, but not both. I feel I cannot explore femme identity without being lauded or rejected for my apparent political decisions to exist as a black femme in a non-traditional way. Participant 71. But the participants of my survey who lifted the specific issues that come with this dual identity weren't only negative. Growing up black and a lesbian and autistic, femininity didn't feel innate or like something I possessed at all, really. Often it was something I felt was out of my reach, probably due to the ways in which society upholds white femininity as the be-all, ends-all. Through my femme identity, I feel I've been able to reclaim and reconstruct feminine gender roles on my own terms. Participant 24. Invisibility among femmes can take on, just like the identity itself, many forms. From struggling to find a queer community, to having to come out all the time, to feeling like your body doesn't fit the white feminine criteria. But many participants that lifted the issue of invisibility said that as well as an issue, it is also a privilege. Passing is safe, and the positive aspects that come with passing shouldn't be downplayed or overlooked. Unlike many other queer identities, for many femmes, this invisibility allowed them to control their outings themselves. To summarize, being straight passing is a double-edged sword. I feel at a low risk of getting hate crimed, but at the expense of finding it harder to integrate into the queer community. Participant 20. Part 3. End discussion. What femme means to you is only yours to decide. Femme can be a power tool, and if anything is needed, it's that. Femininity is no lesser than masculinity, and if you want to use it, use it. I began this video with a quote from Maria Hoskin. To this day, society has still not widely made cognitive space for the existence of femininity that is not aimed at men. And I think that holds the core to what being femme is. Femme is an answer to the fact that society has not grasped the idea of femininity without patriarchal norms. Femininity comes with prejudice and preconceived ideas. It makes you invisible as a queer woman, and it deems your self-proclaimed femininity patriarchal unless you prove that queerness. Drag queens and femme men are suffering discrimination and violence. This is due to femmephobia. But they are also allowed by many feminists to wear pink and have high heels without carrying the clothes of the enemy. This is also femmephobia, because women assigned female at birth and non-binary people assigned female at birth are not allowed the same expression by large feminist groups. If we only allow certain aesthetics to be performed by those who are deemed unfit for it, we are severely simplifying what gender expression can do for anyone. Femme as an identity has been around forever. It has meant so many things during that time. It has been used by lesbian women and bisexual women and gay men, trans women and drag queens. Isn't it great that a word that describes femininity has been used to empower all these different kinds of people for over 100 years? Shouldn't we continue to open that identity up? When one enters certain spaces, like this video on YouTube.
Femme is an identity adopted not just by lesbian women, but has also been reclaimed as an identity by gay men who don't care to be stigmatized just for being feminine. It's also used by non-binary, gender non-conforming people who don't want to strictly identify as women, but are on the feminine end of the spectrum.
There is a lot of anger in the comment fields. Voices saying that if anyone can use femme, that is erasing lesbian history. Lesbians have often been erased. I talk about this all the time in other videos. Lesbians have been fetishized and made visible only for the male gaze. Lesbian sexuality has been infantilized, erased. We've been seen as gal pals, immature, effaced. And history is important. History can create a community and bring people together. But with femme as an identity, it is more complex. It's more complex because, 1, femme in ballroom culture has also used it, and 2, many of the ideas and historical facts of butchfem culture, such as high-femme meaning stone femme and bisexuality not being part of the history, are new ideas. They're new concepts. There is nothing to protect. There is no history to refer to. That femme is a lesbian exclusive label is incorrect. We need to stop continuing to spread information without reliable sources, especially if it makes you mad, sad, or angry. I'm gonna end this video so cheesy, but honestly, there are so many negative things happening for queers at the moment. We are living in a time that is not progressing in terms of human rights and LGBTQ issues. Stop arguing about the existence of he/him lesbians or bisexual femmes. Both valid identities for your information. And if you don't agree, shut the up. It doesn't matter. Focus on the real issues. Unite, for fuck's sake. Get out on the street. Of the 109 answers that I received by looking at YouTube videos and TikToks and scrolling through Tumblr and reading sickening amounts of literature, there were things that were recurring. The happiness and joy femininity can bring, as well as the issues on invisibility. I chose to have Femme Invisibility as the last chapter because I wanted this video to end with community. Even though femmes of color live and suffer from a different kind of invisibility, the question of femme issues was the question with the most coherent answers. There was, in that question, a meeting. Isn't that something to focus on instead? So I say this to all the femmes watching this. Work together to change the meaning of looking gay. Question why people assume your sexuality. Question why society deem everything pink and sexy as inherently mirroring low self-esteem. And why society still see being caring, nurturing, and emotionally protective as something weak. Protect femme men, include trans women, invite black femmes into your communities. Listen to people who know what they are talking about, and once again, normalize asking for sources. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have watched this far and watched all of it and still want to fight in the comment field, feel free. Let's have a conversation. I upload like 3-4 videos per year, so a subscription means everything to me and barely bothers you, so you can click it right here. If you want to talk to me, you can email me or become a patron. Thank you extra much to my patrons: Key Heart Lion, Arbis, Harry, Utten, Katie 7122, Nell Guinevere, Johanna K, and Maria, as well as Mahalia, Joe, Cody, and Tanya Evans, which became patrons after I recorded this video. Thank you all. I'll see the 7 of you pretty soon, and the rest of you, I'll see you around eventually.